this conference have to do with building momentum for local community power, jobs, growth, and so forth. And community wealth building as an economic frame is entirely consistent with that. It is both a strategy for addressing entrenched deprivation and inequalities that many of our communities face, but it's also an opportunity and a method for a kind of community-driven problem solving that aims at inclusivity and local empowerment. Now, those are lofty words and they can be interpreted in many ways, but community wealth building has a very clear frame on them. And that is that first, the term which my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, invented as a term of art about 15 years ago. It's a strategy for building prosperity, shared prosperity in community, in place, through the reconfiguration of local institutions and local economic processes on the basis of greater democratic ownership, broader ownership of assets, keeping the wealth that exists in our communities, even the poorest communities and neighborhoods, from keeping that wealth from leaking out of our areas so that we get a multiplier effect, leveraging local assets that all too often are not leveraged for economic empowerment, such as the purchasing power of anchor institutions, universities, hospitals, cultural centers, having them buy local, hire local, invest local in order to create greater economic opportunity and resilience. The final thing I'd say, to not dominate this, Danielle, is community wealth building is an institution building approach. It's not merely policy, it's not merely politics. It's building new kinds of institutions in our communities that can add to economic vitality and resilience. So these could include cooperatives, employee-owned businesses, community land trusts, municipal ownership of assets, anchor institution strategy, public banking, community finance, all of these pieces working together. In other words, to create a local, vibrant, inclusive community, very distinct from one I would say most of our communities labor under these days, which is an extractive community that literally is taking wealth out of our the places that we live. The last thing, Danielle, while it is true here in the United States that, as you know, we have two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats are more liberal or progressive, the Republicans more conservative. While it is true that the community wealth strategies have been taken up in the main by Democratic mayors and city councilors and so forth, nonetheless, I've found that this is a strategy that can divide the red-blue divide. Of course, our red-blue is the opposite of your red-blue. But Republican mayors are beginning to adapt these strategies. North Dakota, one of the most conservative states in the United States, overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump for president, has the only public socialized bank in the entire country. So while perhaps these strategies lend themselves more to people on the left, in fact, they really, at the local level, can translate very well across the political spectrum.
No, I think it's a really interesting element and something perhaps we need to think about a bit in the UK context. And I'm not sure how much and how immersed or aware you are of the kind of community power movement and in the UK and how that might or might not differ from community wealth building. Is it a subset or is it a philosophy? How do you see it oriented?
Well, as I understand, the community power movement in the UK, I think what it can do is lend momentum and urgency to this sort of reconfiguration of local economies. But I firmly believe, and of course this is my belief, it doesn't need to be the belief of everyone on this call, but at least as it's practiced in the United States, let me say that. A lot of sort of community empowerment and power limits itself to trying to right some of the worst abuses and deficiencies in our communities, in our local context. It is, not to disparage it, but in a very, from a systems thinking approach, it's tinkering around the edges. It's trying to get some better people elected who have some more better policies that we favor and so forth. But the overall momentum of the local economy continues in the same direction. You know, there's a big effort in the United States to have our minimum wage, which is appalling. It's $7.25 an hour in the US. So if you work full-time for a year at the minimum wage, you'll be making about 3/4 of the poverty level in the country. I mean, you don't even get to poverty. So there's a big movement forward to bring in a $15 minimum wage. And there's a lot of community action and empowerment. I am all for that. I think that'd be fantastic. It would put money in people's hands. It would resolve a lot of issues of poverty and deprivation. Nonetheless, even if that results, if we keep the same kind of institutional configurations and structures and broader ownership patterns over capital, wealth inequality in the United States is simply going to keep going. People will have some more money, but the fundamental problem of the system doesn't get addressed. And that's where it's marrying the community empowerment movement with structural change and structural design. In there, I think, is the winning formula and is where community wealth building starts to get expressed at scale.
That's really, I mean, that's to me is that central holding on to that concept of institution building feels really an important element here. And we've got a question from Chris Dabb, who's really picking up on that and saying essentially in the UK, that whole pattern of community ownership, which, you know, as in the US, there was a history of that, you know, an idea of collective ownership, but that was really dismantled. And really, I suppose it's asking for some practical examples of where that can be rebuilt and where communities in the UK, perhaps if you have some UK examples, maybe not in Preston, I don't know. But the idea of, you know, where can that, how can that be rebuilt? And I mean, I have a follow-on question, which is really, you know, ownership and control. Are we conflating these things? Because communities can control what's going on, but not necessarily own it. And really just trying to get unpick that a bit. But first, Chris's kind of focus on, you know, rebuilding institutions.
Well, it's certainly the case, Chris, that over the last 40 years or so, both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, as the neoliberal consensus grew and took hold and indeed swept the world, while I'm not in favor of the politics of neoliberalism, one does have to give it due credit for being extraordinarily successful, albeit I think in a very negative way. There was a systematic attempt to erode the public's faith in common ownership, cooperative ownership, public ownership. There was a systematic attempt to have it be seen as inefficient, bureaucratic. You know, Ronald Reagan famously said, it was one of his biggest applause lines, that the worst sentence you could possibly hear is when someone comes to your front door and says, "Hello, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." So the idea was to just destroy the viability of government. Certainly what we've seen in the United States is this pandemic crisis and the financial fallout from it, the economic destruction, really demonstrated the role of government needs to play in solving something like that. I do think it's interesting, while the belief in the United States, at least if you ask the average person on the street, they would say, oh, everything's being privatized. We're no longer doing that public ownership. In fact, there's a very big countervailing trend that's going on. One of the problems we suffer in the United States is that smaller rural communities, many of them in the very conservative southern part of the United States, states like Mississippi, Alabama, and so forth, the large broadband internet companies won't wire communities because there's simply not enough profit in it. And so we have this new phenomenon of hundreds of conservative Republican mayors who wouldn't have a single thing positive to say about what they consider to be socialism, have in fact established in their cities socialized communications and internet broadband companies because it just works and it's cheaper for the consumer, it's profitable. So we need to rebuild a sense of community and public, and actually demonstrate that these ideas of broader ownership, whether it's worker ownership through collectives or municipal ownership of assets like broadband or public utilities, that they can be good business propositions. It doesn't have to be simply ideological. Well, only labor would support that, not the Tories. It actually makes sense in many ways. Having said that, we also need to acknowledge that in the past, a lot of public ownership has been far too bureaucratic, undemocratic, too centralized. So if we're going to move in this direction, we need to bring sunlight and democracy into public ownership, rather than have it be some revisiting of what the 1950s were like.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of questions here are coming up really about, how feasible, given the kind of political settlement we have in the UK at the moment, with the Conservative government, and really what appetite you've perceived. And we're aware that obviously when you come from abroad into a context, you can sometimes see it more clearly. What you've seen in terms of appetite for this kind of work, or this kind of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I could say a few things. Let me just say I'm always leery. One of the unfortunate character flaws of Americans is we think we always have all the answers. And if you all would just listen to us, we could get you shaped up. So I don't mean to put myself in the ugly American camp. I do think, Danielle, certainly labor and the left has embraced community wealth building more than the Tories or the Lib Dems. It's just the reality. The Economist famously had a headline about 2 years ago, Preston, Jeremy Corbyn's favorite city or something like that, favorite town, because of the community wealth building underway there. I've talked to people in the Conservative Party and Tories and in councillors and so forth and Lib Dems. I think there's a lot of interest in these ideas because a lot of them really make a lot of sense. I think I can almost appreciate from a local councillor level, if community wealth building has been so identified with the Labour Party, it just, even if you want to do it, it makes it harder. That's what Labor's doing, so I certainly can't do that. And I think there are places, and I don't have a lot of data, but where a breakthrough is starting to happen. I know Preston is based in Lancashire County, and while the Preston City Council is a Labour council, the Lancashire County Council is a Tory council. And yet the Lancashire Council is interested in exploring the idea of a public bank, which would be capitalized by the resources of the county and the city, because people can understand it's very important for a locality to control its own source of capital. So I think there's opportunity. Let me just, from my point of view, just lay down a caution. Is, community wealth building, when we identified that term 15 years ago, I did Google searches at the time. Literally, you could not find the three words community wealth building on the internet. If you go now, you'll find like 15 million hits. And the danger is that the term becomes a catchphrase for just a new kind of local development. It doesn't have any definition, any sharpness to it. I think there's a danger of this term being co-opted to really justify the same old policies, but we're going to kind of level things up and do a little bit better and so forth. So it's very important, whatever party and ideology or politics starts to enter into this, we need to understand the term enough so we could really dial in and say, no, that what we mean is this institution structure building. Broadening ownership over capital is absolutely essential. It can't be left out of the equation. The last thing I'd say is I knew this term was catching on about a year ago because here in the United States, there was a full page advertisement in a magazine. And the headline was, our company is proud to be building community wealth. And underneath it, what it turned out is it was an advertisement from the fracking industry of America, which is about the most extractive industry you can possibly imagine. So that's the danger here that we need to navigate.
Well, I've always wondered, as a funder, would we, if a community came to us and said, look, we've got this great, sustainably, it will help our community, really build its wealth and control a really valuable asset, and it's fracking. And I always wondered, would we turn it down? I mean, could we legitimately do that if that is the community's will? Is that completely, to be honest, I know one of my trustees is in the audience and I think she could probably answer that, but I have a feeling, it's a debate to be had about, how that all works and how, who judges all of these things in terms of what a community chooses to do in terms of building the institutions that they perceive as being sustainable ones. Obviously, I think planetary limits are quite important and probably wouldn't fund it, but I think, that is one of the discussions to be had.
Yeah.
I mean, some people have asked some questions really about geographical size, it's ideal geographical sizes or time scales over which this can happen. It's kind of the practicalities and things you've learned. Obviously building on, you've got a really strong base, and I've actually been to Cleveland to understand kind of how that's really working in practice. But I don't know any insights that you and your team have gained about the sort of timescales and practical and the size.
Those are very good questions. So I think the full truth is we're still learning. So, you were very generous in my introduction and setting me up as, a great authority on this. Well, let me tell you, I do know a lot about this and I'm learning every day because, we're just 10, 15 years into this. Having said that, a couple lessons I've learned. First, this is, while national, we would say in our context, federal policy can really support the emergence of community wealth building. It could kind of turbocharge it. It can, changes to tax codes can help incentivize the creation of cooperatives and so forth. And that's a national government effort. Where the heart of community wealth building is, as it says, community. So this is an intensely place-based strategy. Now, the place in Cleveland, for instance, the strategy there, Cleveland's an older industrial city, many of you may know. It had really pretty much collapsed. It's like many communities in the north of England, that were based on an extractive industry. That industry collapsed, and then what's going to happen? In Cleveland, what we did was say, we're not going to take on the whole city. It's not a huge city, but it's about 400,000. What we're going to do is focus in 5 or 6 neighborhoods with a population of about 50,000 souls. And they're the lowest income, most deprived neighborhoods of the city. And can we build a model of worker employee ownership, but linked to community change and development? And that's the heart, and leverage the large institutions of the city, the hospitals, the city government, the universities, so forth. and their purchasing power to help, in a sense, turbocharge this model of job creation, wealth building. And so that's a very clear focus. And, it's now employing it's still early days, it's employing about 300 people in full-time jobs, all of whom were formerly unemployed, half of whom were ex-offenders returning from prison. And they now have living wage jobs, they have profit sharing in their companies, they elect members to the board. So we showed at a neighborhood what it could look like. I'm now in conversations with the mayor's office of Chicago, which is our second largest city. And I don't know the population, but 3-4 million. So it becomes very substantial, maybe even bigger than that. And, Chicago's had a traditional neoliberal trickle-down economic development strategy, and they want to build in a whole community wealth building strategy. And they've come to me and said, here's what we've got, and what do you think? And so there you could see one of the largest cities in America taking the billions of dollars of economic development monies that flow through a city that big and begin to reorient them away from giving subsidies to large, non-locally based extractive corporations and begin to put that money into local businesses, local cooperatives, land trusts, public banks, and so forth. So I think it's harder to do a community wealth strategy if you're in a village of 100 people. It's just difficult. But once you get to a certain scale, even 50, 100,000 people, and have some institution, and then from there you can just scale up. You could even envision this, I think, as a regional strategy, where you could have, say, in the north of England, a number of cities and towns working together, not competing against one another, but leveraging all their assets. In terms of timing, it took us a couple of years to get Evergreen off the ground, and it's been financially viable for a number of years. And, something like 3/5 of all American small businesses fail in the first few years. We're 10 years in and still standing and still growing. In fact, now we've set up a fund for employee ownership that is in Cleveland acquiring local small businesses, maybe 20, 30 workers in it, where the owner wants to retire and doesn't have an exit strategy. We're acquiring those and converting them into cooperatives, which is better for the employees, better wages, and so forth. In Preston, I know we don't want to talk much about Preston, but they've been at their strategy only 6 or 7 years. And certainly if you talk to Matthew Brown, the head of the council there, he would acknowledge the limitations to date. But nonetheless, in 6 or 7 years, Preston has moved from the bottom 20% of the deprivation index to being voted 2 years in a row selected by Demos and PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is hardly, a socialist organization, as the most improved place, the most improved community to live, at least in the north of England. And they've made some real impact. So it's a long-term process to completely reorient a local economy, because, it's taken maybe centuries to build it. But you could start in a reasonable period of time to see real change starting to be made in the community. This is not 30 years from now, something will happen.
That was really encouraging. I mean, one of the things I think that is not perhaps understood when you talk about Cleveland, and because I visited one of the Evergreen cooperative businesses, is that actually the physical realities of who we're talking about, because we are talking in there were essentially people would worry perhaps about there is a concern sometimes when we talk about community, we're not really clear, we're not really saying who we're talking about, and in fact we only engage a strata of the community. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, in Cleveland, it is a lot of the people working in that particular business were Black people, and
Yes.
people buying
Well,
business and holding that business and running that business really encouragingly and so engaged and so feeling ownership of what was going on there. And I think perhaps in some ways we talk in these general terms, the actual people were women, there were Black people, there were, Latino people, and white people. It was a range of people. And I think this is a powerful tool, which isn't, specific to a particular kind of community.
right. And let me say something about that. There's a really good observation, Danielle. And, I firmly believe in my theory of change, I guess, that if you look at the sweep of history, the ownership and control of assets is the foundation of every political economy. Who owns the capital and the assets is going to have an outsized influence on the direction of the whole country and the economy or the community and so forth. So this question of if you really want to address the inequities of society, we have to find strategies to broaden ownership over the capital. And this is not only an economic matter, it actually does put money in people's pockets. As I said, we've had a couple hundred people who, some of whom were long-term unemployed, some of whom were incarcerated for 10 years, who now are becoming homeowners because they have a decent family support and living wage and profit sharing based on what their labor has contributed to the company. I mean, it seems so commonsensical to me, but it's not just a dollars and cents matter or pounds and pence matter. One of the first people we hired at Evergreen had been in prison twice. When we hired him, he was living in his car, his automobile. Everything he had was in that automobile. He was sleeping in it. And we hired him because he'd been in the military before he went into prison. And he had mechanical skills that he had learned in the military. And we needed those skills because this is a large scale industrial laundry with, huge 30-foot long tunnel washers that break down, and you need somebody who can fix stuff. So we hired him, and I asked him after he'd been on the job a few months, what does this opportunity to be an owner of a Evergreen cooperative mean to you? And I was just absolutely certain he's going to say, life's better. I've got money in my pocket. And I'm sure he felt that way, but that's not how he answered. What he said, and it's always stayed with me, and I thought it was quite profound. He said, I never thought a person like me, by which he meant all of his disadvantages and everything that happened in his life, I never thought a person like me could own a share of a corporation like this and have a say over it. And that spoke to me because I think the levels of deprivation and inequity that our societies, both yours and mine, experience, it's not simply people can't feed their families, and that's terrible, but it suppresses our conception of ourselves as people with agency and strong democratic citizens, which is what we need, small d democratic citizens. So I see this in a way, it's very much economics, it's very much systemic change toward a new political economy, but in some ways it's an opportunity to liberate people who care about their families and their communities and give them a role in shaping it rather than simply being consumers of whatever is being decided.
I think that's really, echoes very much the, just the personal conversations that I was able to have when I was in Cleveland with people. I mean, just, people who, felt so strongly, almost to tears level of, this helped me change my life. It wasn't that it changed my life. They were able to, through this mechanism, to change their own lives. And that's the most powerful element. I mean, one of the things, talking about life-changing, sort of circumstances, the pandemic. I mean, there are a few questions here about, the degree to which, the so-called hopeful recovery, which is not austerity, but is recovery. What opportunities or shifts, possible shifts,
I think Danielle's frozen, but I know where she was going, so let me take that up.
Might make community wealth building. Am I back yet?
You're back, yes.
Good, excellent. Sorry about that. I can hear you, so you just need to do a bit of singing if I disappear again, because I will come back. It was really just the question about whether there's opportunities from the pandemic that may or may not make community wealth building a possibility. In the US, I don't know, or the UK, I mean, one thing that we've observed is certainly an understanding and interest in the degree to which, the sense that communities can do things of value. But the institution building, I think, is missing from the equation, from my observation.
Well, I think, I've been involved in, I guess you'd call it, social justice activism almost my entire life, for 50 years. So I've been at this a long time. And honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a period of time that had greater possibilities for really fundamental change than the one we're going through. And I say that having come through an extraordinarily dark 4 years in the United States under the Trump administration. I think that the pandemic has done a couple of things. One, it certainly made ever more obvious to people what was obvious to probably most of us or all of us on this call, but maybe not to all people in our societies, about just the inequities of society and how badly it's been working for so many people. It's just ripped off any veneer there. And so that's been a moment, for at least in the United States, of national truth-telling, which I think is very, very important. I think also what it's shown is, in many ways, communities have been forced, in a sense, to start to address their problems in whole new ways. And it reminds me of a period 100 years ago, almost, in the United States, during the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929, the early 30s, before President Roosevelt was elected and the American New Deal began. There's a period of 4 or 5 years that American historians call, in the United States, the laboratories of democracy. Because what was happening is there was such, nothing was positive was happening at the national level as the Depression raged. And so communities started to experiment for themselves. And one of the experiments that began in Alaska, which was then a province in a small community, where Alaskans pooled their money to help seniors, local senior citizens who didn't have family, and provided them something so they wouldn't be destitute. That kind of little idea was lifted up when the politics changed by the Roosevelt administration and became the basis of our social security system, which is one of the most important safety nets we have in the country. And so I think there's a period of intense experimentation going on in communities. The other thing, at least in the US, is now that there's an administration that really wants to try to deal with these things rather than, as they say, gaslight everybody that really the pandemic's not that bad like the last one. I think there's almost political space, at least in the US. Your context might be different, it might be more localized, but for new big game-changing ideas around community wealth building to all of a sudden move to the fore. By way of example, as we looked at the pandemic over the last year, we could see the devastation and the collapse of hundreds of thousands of small businesses in the United States. And of course, the small businesses are what provide the bulk of employment in the United States, I suspect in the UK as well. And so these businesses are starting to go out of they're collapsing. Lots of boarded up storefronts and so forth. And we created a concept we call local economy preservation funds, which was an invention we created based on an idea from the New Deal 100 years ago, where there was something the federal government had, the National Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a way to keep businesses alive. The government, at one point, the US government was the main investor, the top investor in business in America to keep it afloat. We said, what if we took this idea and localized it into towns? Like if the city government invested in the local small businesses, kept them viable, over time also worked with owners who might want to retire and transition them to community or worker ownership and so forth. And this idea has gotten taken up and made it into the Biden administration as one of the top ideas for preserving local economies to keep the diversity of local small business rather than just have it all be Amazon and Walmart and so forth. And there is within this American Stimulus Act, which will be voted on today and approved and signed by the president at the end of this week, in the $1.9 trillion, there's $10 billion allocated that can be directly purposed to capitalize these funds all over the country. So that's an opportunity. $10 billion, you know, it's in some ways small beer in the great American economy, but nonetheless, $10 billion moving into a new model like this is very exciting. And I think there are lots of other opportunities like that, Danielle.
That's really, I mean, that's such a hopeful note. And I think I'm meant to be sort of wrapping up, which is a rather horrifying thought, really, frankly. But I just really wanted to say that it was been such an honor to talk to you about all of this, because I think you know, despite your protestations, you are an absolute wealth of knowledge and understanding, but also kind of that the real understanding, which is flexible. It's not, there's no sort of, this has got to be, these 6 things have got to be there, elsewise it's not really community wealth building. It's the understanding that these are contextual issues. And I really think if we hold on to the idea of what institutions are we building for communities, you know, or what are communities able to build, what do they need, and how can they build institutions which will last? And I think there are some important things about the level of ownership in them, and cooperatives obviously are a great model, but there are others. But also the idea possibly of that great laboratory that we might be entering into. And I think, you know, there are some opportunities that for us to really try things out. And at Friends Provident Foundation, that is really kind of one of the key things we're trying to support is people, communities all over the country, local areas, as well as looking at the systems questions, because we've had some questions about relationship with climate change and, you know, all these big systemic issues as well. And really trying to think of how, you know, how can we make a meaningful intervention here, which will really turn around and build sustainability into local economies. And obviously community wealth building is a great tool and a way for us all to do that. And hopefully it fits very well into the community power agenda. But I think I'm meant to be handing back over to Adam. And I just really want to thank you, Ted, for waking up incredibly early. I think it's probably like 6 a.m. now, isn't it? Something.
It's 6:45. The sun is rising over
Denver. Oh, that's fine.
And I'm going to go down and make my second cup of coffee so I can continue my day. Just thank you, everyone. I really appreciate those of you who are here. One thing in back of me, this is my home office. You can see 4 little prints there. And those, just so you know, they remind me every day of England, because they're prints that I got from I bought at a cooperative community coffee house in the community of Morecambe. And young local activists in their 20s are fighting the good fight there. So inspiring. So every day I get to be in the presence of Morecambe here. So thank you very much. And thank you, Danielle, for making time for this. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic to see you. Yeah,
Thank you.
great to see you. Thanks. So handing back over to Adam. Cheers.
Thank you, Danielle and Ted. That was so interesting. It just felt like you covered so much detail and information on community wealth building and economic vision more generally. And I love the idea of laboratories of democracy, all these innovation happening down on the grassroots, which ultimately filters up and influences what happens at national level. I sort of feel that's where we are right now. All this innovation, all this community power spirit spreading in the UK. Westminster hasn't really noticed yet, but they will at some point, and then the influence will really, really happen. Hopefully things will really change systemically. So thank you so much.